Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen, and a very good day. We are back and welcome back. We have been discussing with Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy his book, his latest book, Pakistan, Origins, Identity, and Future. We have covered 3 of the 5 parts, and we will shortly be we'll start to cover the 4th part. I think it's a good time to give you an overview of the architecture of this book once again. The part 1, Dr. Hoodbhoy names long before the two-nation idea, and he has 2 chapters in that: Identity Formation in Medieval India and the British Reinvent India. The part 2, he calls it a closer look at Pakistan's 3 founder heroes. And in the last chapter of this section, he includes 3 opponents of Pakistan and of Jinnah. So the 3 founder heroes, you won't take long to guess, is Sir Syed, he calls the lonely modernizer; Allama Iqbal, premier poet, preacher, and politician; and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he calls him liberal, secular, visionary, and he has a question mark after that. And in the 3 opponents, he discusses Maulana Abul Ala Maududi, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. In part 3, we discuss postnatal blues, which were the fundamentally difficult problems that Pakistan faced and tragically lost half of the country. And the 2 on which he concentrates rightly are East Pakistan, and he calls as stubborn angularities East Pakistan and then Balochistan. So we have done this. In part 4, Dr. Hoodbhoy has asked 5, I think, questions that are very close to our hearts. It's one of those things that everything we wanted to ask but somehow were afraid to ask, kind of a thing. The first question he asks is, was partition worth the price? The second, what is the ideology of Pakistan and does it matter? The third, why couldn't Pakistan become an Islamic state? And the fourth, why is Pakistan a Praetorian state? And fifth, identity. I'm a Pakistani, but what am I? And then the last part, he looks ahead and gives his prognosis after having expertly, as a doctor, identified and diagnosed the problem. He then launches in as to what can be done. So, Dr. Saab, let's get into part 4, the 5 big questions. And the first question you say is, was partition worth the price? And you ask a question that in a public space in Pakistan would be heretical. I mean, if you were to go ask this kind of a question, they will look at you and say, you know, where are you from, right? But you ask, was partition worth the price? A question we must ask 75 years after independence. So not sure how a common man would answer it, but most from the lower middle class upward perhaps would answer it emphatically, I think, in the affirmative. Do you agree?
Yes and no. It depends upon which part of Pakistan and what class of people you ask this question from. So certainly, if you were to ask this question in Punjab, and you were to ask it of the middle class over there, the answer would be, well, close to 101%. If you were to ask in Sindh, not sure, but it would be 50-50 perhaps. In Balochistan, I think much lower. It would be, could be 30-70, but I don't know. These are just speculations.
Right.
But the point is that this is a question that has to be asked, because this was an extraordinarily bloody episode in the history of the world, not just of the subcontinent, but of the world. It counts among the 10 biggest genocides, massacres of history. So yes, this is a question to be asked. Was it worth building a separate nation, a separate country on the basis of religious identity? And it can be answered both ways by even well-meaning people. So here's something that is about history that you can't ever be sure of what would happen if one element of that is tampered with. Now let's say that Mr. Jinnah had died of tuberculosis or whatever, or some terrorist attack or whatever, some years before partition. Let's say back in 1940, even after making the demand for Pakistan. It's quite likely that there would not have been a partition in 1947. Quite likely that there might not have been a partition for a very long time, or no partition at all. That India could have remained unified. Would it have been good or bad? Okay, now since this is something that has not happened, we must only speculate. Now, if there were rules to the game, we could do a mathematical simulation of it. You know, we do all these simulations, put in probabilities here, there, identify nodes, and let this evolve as a Markov process. But we don't have that liberty over here. Okay, so let's just speculate on the consequence. Suppose Pakistan had not been formed, and that partition didn't happen, and India continued for another 10 years after 1945. Then we could have a much worse situation. It's a possibility that there could have been communal riots, that some very fiery leader would emerge and would instigate communal riots. We see communal riots as occurring even today in India. Right. So if you take a pessimistic view of things, you'd say that things would be out of control, and it would be a very bad outcome if Pakistan had not been formed. But you could take the other view. You could say that the carnage of partition would have been saved. That Hindus and Muslims who had lived together for centuries and lived in relative peace. See, we can only talk about relative peace, because there's never peace even within one community, and sometimes even within one family. So if you take an optimistic view of things, then you'll say that, yeah, there would have been a bit of fighting, it would have been controllable, but it wouldn't have gotten out of hand. Now, as I say, since I don't have the mathematical machinery here to deal with this, that's all that can be said.
You actually, even though you say that you don't have a mathematical model, you do very clearly answer this question clearly answer it with a nuance. You talk of the winners, and then you talk of the losers. Would you like to elaborate? I mean, you identify groups that clearly you think won as a result of Pakistan coming into existence, and then you talk of the losers.
Yes, that was the outcome. So let's start with the winners. The movement for Pakistan began in UP. As we talked earlier, it was Sir Syed Ahmad Khan who first articulated the idea that there is a Muslim Qawm, that the Muslims of India somehow joined together. Never mind the Bengalis, that's another matter. We talked about that. They're not part of the Qawm, but the others are. Well, they were insistent that this was not their land. Where they had lived for centuries was not their land. Their real land was elsewhere. And so they migrated. Did they lose or did they win? Well, let's remember that these were people who could not compete in terms of jobs, and they couldn't compete in terms of jobs with the Hindus because they weren't adequately educated. They had very little representation in the civil service, although not in the army they were okay, but in positions where professionals were required. So when they did go across to Pakistan, they won because there was so little competition over there. So they became administrators, they became professors, they became doctors with relatively low levels of competence, and they started heading their departments and whatever. So you could say that the educated ones amongst them were the winners, but then there were a lot of poor Muhajirs who went across, and they were not the winners.
Not the winners.
And so that eventually crystallized into the MQM, and we know that.
So the salaried class is the one you're referring to, was a clear winner, or at least the salaried class coming largely from the Punjab and the Mahajir community at that point, and even if from some of the other provinces were the winners. But the first group that you call the big winner is the large landlords.
Are the large landlords. In the Muslim League, the majority were the Divanas, the Khoros, the big ones of those times. Very few businessmen. The businessmen were Bombay based, and although they supported the Muslim League, but only to an extent, and only a few of them migrated into Pakistan. Some did well, but had they remained over there, they would have done just as well there too. But it's the landlords, basically, who gained in two ways. Now they had political power as well as their lands. Furthermore, there was now the opportunity of seizing the lands that were left behind by the Hindus. And so there was an immediate land grab, which actually Jinnah was quite disturbed by, but which he didn't do very much to prevent. He couldn't have done very much to prevent because these were his own lieutenants who were grabbing the lands and the properties of the fleeing Hindus. That was the big business of that time. So obviously the winners are those. The winners among them, the chief winners, is the army.
Pakistan.
Now the army was the only organized force at that time. The British Army, it was trained. Many of so they were trained in Sandhurst, or they were trained at Dehradun College or other military training establishments across India. And there, of course, Hindu and Muslim officers were side by side. They got together. They were trained by the same British officers, and they knew how to organize themselves. They had a modern mindset. And when they had to choose between India and Pakistan, I mean the Muslim officers, most of them, of course, opted for Pakistan. Well, that's when they found that they were so important. And in comparison to the factionalism that was there in the Muslim League, and the Muslim League pretty much dissipated after 2 years after Jinnah's death, but the army remained intact. And so they were the big winners.
We can also, I suppose, add or tag them the bureaucrats, particularly the ICS class and others who had come in with the army as the big beneficiary.
So I was going to add that on. Actually, I had sort of added them on because when we talked about the Muhajirs, they were actually what Hamza Alvi calls the Salariyat. So the push for Pakistan actually came from them. It didn't come from the army officers. It didn't come from the businessmen. No, it came from the salaried classes who couldn't compete in the Indian civil service, and they were resentful of the fact that they were not the judges and lawyers. Well, judges and lawyers, okay, to an extent, but they were nowhere there in the medical profession or other professions that were important at the time.
I mean, Aligarh University, I suppose, in a way, represents that aspiring salaried class of the Salariyat, right?
Absolutely.
They're the ones. And you also point out amongst the winners as a mid-level peasants. What do you mean by that?
So there were peasants who didn't possess any land. There were peasants who had small amounts of land, but not insignificant ones. And right next to them would be a Hindu owner and maybe a bigger owner. And so then partition is in their interest, because then I guess it's part of human nature to want to grab onto more, as much as you can. Well, they were in competition with the bigger landlords, but they did get some part of that. So there was a kind of benefit over there as well.
Okay. So now come down to the losers. And there, unfortunately, the list is a little longer than the winners.
The biggest loser was the Indian Muslim. And this is exactly what Maulana Abul Kalam Azad had feared. He said, if the majority over here leave, what will happen to us, those who have decided to stay within India? And since only something like 10% of the Muslim population moved across to Pakistan, the majority were left there, and then their patriotism was suspect. Why didn't they also leave? So they became the victim of taunts then, and are the victim of taunts today as well. Mm-hmm. They did. Well, the ones who got left behind, actually is very interesting. You know, a friend of mine told me that his father was at Aligarh, and Mr. Jinnah had come to give a lecture to the students, and he asked precisely this question: what is it, what will happen to us if we don't, to those of us who will stay here? And Mr. Jinnah's reply was, sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. He said it thrice. Well, I guess they were sacrificed at the altar, mm-hmm. and then they paid the price for it.
Right. Interesting, because anecdotally, my family migrated from India, and those of us who came to Pakistan, relative to our cousins that were left in India, did far better. And so I once mentioned it to an Indian friend of mine, and I was saying, well, clearly we benefited. Look at sort of where the Muslims of India are and where those who migrated ended up. And he gave me a very interesting and unexpected answer. He said, of course, you would do better, because the people who move are already the more dynamic or the more opportunistic or risk takers. And the people that refused to move were anyway much more tied to the tradition or the life that they already had. And plus, he said, they lost their role models and they lost their leadership in this partition. So you, in a way, left the people who couldn't move or wouldn't move, were bereft of the sustenance that they needed from the community.
Absolutely. I'd just add one thing to what you'd say. Yes, the more dynamic ones took the initiative of moving.
That's right.
But then there was a vast majority which was underskilled, had no particular education, both among Muslims and among Hindus, who didn't move of their own volition.
Right.
The situation became such that in their villages there was murder and mayhem all around. They had no option but to move. Right. And this happened particularly in Punjab, where...
Well, so the Muslims who stayed in India, but then you specifically talk of two other, actually a lot of others, Muslims specifically. You talk of Muslims of Bengal as losers.
Yes, I think that's pretty obvious. Because they were the most enthusiastic about partition. And then comes 1971 and the Pakistan army unleashes its terror upon them. They were, it was a second partition in a sense. 10 million refugees pour out from East Pakistan into India. And then the Biharis also get slaughtered. The Biharis, Punjabis, they also, well, they form part of the Mukti Bahini and they commit their atrocities as well. So, yes, the Muslims of Bengal certainly weren't the winners in this. But then it's very paradoxical that some of those who were most enthusiastic for partition.
That's right.
I mean not the Bengalis, I mean the Ahmadis.
That's right. They were the other losers you point out, the Ahmadis. They were big losers.
They are today in a state of incredible persecution in Pakistan.
Right. And those who could leave have left. I mean, they are no longer in Pakistan, obviously.
They try to hide.
Yeah.
They try to avoid being. They try to hide in every nook and corner that they can find,
right.
And yet they're not successful in that. So unless they convert to Islam and explicitly repudiate their faith, they don't stand a chance in Pakistan. Their lives are in danger. Right. I have a very tragic incident to relate to you. When I carried the dead body of my colleague, Naseem Babar, he was earlier a student at Quaid-e-Azam University, then came on to the faculty, then became my neighbor in the university housing colony. And this is the 10th of October, 1994, at 10 p.m. that I hear 2 gunshots. And I go find him lying in his driveway. He died in my car as I took him to the hospital. And so they don't stand a chance. And yet it was Jaffrelot Khan, who was the foreign minister of Pakistan, appointed by Mr. Jinnah.
Yeah, they gave their blood, sweat, tears, money to make Pakistan. They were they were enthusiastic. You point out the Biharis of East Pakistan as the losers.
Yes, we did talk about that. And then there's a double twist to that. The Biharis get attacked by the Bengalis. They want to come to West Pakistan. Of course, it's Pakistan now. And they're not allowed. But hang on, this is the two-nation theory. The two-nation theory. So why, according to that, are you not allowing those who gave their blood to fight for Pakistan?
Yeah,
that's
a sheer abandonment, particularly in the way they helped the Pakistan army and the operation, and their loyalties lay totally with West Pakistan, and they should definitely not have been abandoned.
So essentially we closed off the borders after partition. We said Indian Muslims, yeah, they can come maybe 1 or 2 or 200, 500,000, but no, not by the tens of thousands. Forget the millions. And The closing of the borders for the Biharis was even a clearer indication of that.
Okay. And then you add two more Muslims in this, the Muslims of Kashmir and the Muslims of Balochistan. You already, in a way, I think we talked of Balochistan a little while ago, but these are also the losers.
Yes. Now, after 1947, you have the Kashmir War, which was certainly in Mr. Jinnah's knowledge, if not by his orders. And this led to the line of control, which to this day separates the Muslims of in the Indian administered part of Kashmir and of the Pakistani administered part of Kashmir. This is an impermeable border. Briefly, it had become traversable, but not anymore. And so you have Muslims on a stone throw on the other side. It's tragic. Families have been divided. Nothing. They were the losers.
Yeah. And they continue, right now they're going through even a much tougher period. In India, you make a very interesting, there's a sentence that caught my attention, that the Pakistan movement was barren ground for progressive thought. And then in the losers, you obviously mentioned communists and leftists who were also the big losers in Pakistan. But there is a bit of a connection that as if this is to be taken true, your sentence, it was a barren ground for progressive thought. I mean, that's a very sort of a depressing, because if there isn't going to be a progressive thought, what is the hope of progress?
Mr. Jinnah was very clear about some things. As we had discussed earlier, he was very adamant that don't ask me what Pakistan is going to be. We'll decide on its structure, on its priorities once it comes into existence. But there's one thing that he was adamant on: it's not going to be socialist or communistic. And of course, land reform never happened for that reason either. So this being before everybody, that the Muslim League leadership was entirely feudal, with a sprinkling of capitalists, completely empty of intellectuals, of those who wanted some kind of social justice, of socialism, except one person, Mia Iftikharuddin, perhaps. Therefore, it was something debated within the Communist Party of India whether we should be supporting the Pakistan movement or not. Now, communists and socialists are, by definition, universalists in the sense that they say that the workers and peasants of the world must unite, irrespective of their nation states. And this has been true from the time of Marx, who said that the workers of Germany, the workers of England must unite, even though the two countries are in opposition to each other. This was to be a universal, a global movement, and so would recognize no national borders also. This is what made communism so lethal in the eyes of the United States. Mm-hmm. So they were very conflicted. But once Stalin fought with the British against Hitler and saw it in the national interest of the, saw it in the working class interest, I said. At that point, the resistance within the Communist Party of India melted, and they started characterizing the movement as progressive. And so
Pakistani movement.
The Pakistan movement started creating an illusion upon themselves, inside themselves, that this was to build a progressive country for Muslims. And so you remember that that famous poem of Faiz Ahmad Faiz, ये दाग दाग उजाला ये शब गजीदा सहर ये वो सहर तो नहीं जिसकी आरज़ू लेकर चले थे यार कि मिल जाएगी दश्ते फलक, etc. So there was then an order from within the Communist Party to not oppose Mr. Jinnah, to work for the creation of Pakistan. Of course, everybody was not comfortable with that, and a lot of progressive Muslims did remain behind in India, but a lot of them did migrate across.
And now, of course, they're being decimated.
And they very soon came to their senses.
Right.
They found that this was a state which was not hard capitalist, but this was hard feudal, with an army that was then tied to the United States and which crushed them and never allowed any kind of a progressive movement to emerge until Bhutto came along. That was in the 1968 onwards, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
And it was very limited.
So let me just, before I move to the sort of my second and last question on this question you asked, was partition worth the price? The winners, you say, are large landlords, Pakistan's military, salaried classes, and mid-level peasants. And the losers, Muslims of Bengal, Biharis of East Pakistan, Muslims who stayed in India, the Muslims of Kashmir, the Muslims of Balochistan, Ahmadis, now expelled from Islam, and communists and leftists. So that is the list. So the answer, in a way, from losers is a mixed answer. It's not, and as it should be, a nuanced answer. Dr. Saab, moving on, you quote the parable of the Cobra Effect. What is it, and how is it related to the question, was partition worth the price? What is this Cobra Effect?
Well, the Cobra, the British gave a certain amount of money for the number of cobras that you killed, because cobras are dangerous snakes. And
in India, when they were ruling, they announced this, that anybody who kills a cobra gets some certain money.
Yes, absolutely. And then people started getting, well, you know, people are clever. So they started breeding
cobras.
Yes.
And then killing them.
Yes.
And then selling
and then
them.
selling them.
Okay.
So at the end of it all, you get more cobras. Now, how does it apply to Pakistan? In multiple ways. One is that once you make religion the central currency, then you're going to get people who deal in that currency. And so they're going to then they're going to breed more cobras. Those cobras then will come back to bite you. Right. That is one way of interpreting it. And there are several other ways of looking at this also, but yes.
Yeah, but basically what you're saying, that a bad solution actually can worsen the problem. So they were trying to get rid of cobras, let's say in your example, and the solution was, we'll give you money if you kill it. And of course, now at the end of it, you have more cobras running around. And so a bad solution. How then are you relating it to the creation of Pakistan was a bad solution to a problem of inequality? Is the problem of lack of opportunity for the Muslims?
Lack of opportunity for the Muslims, and a belief that if you separate yourself off, that will be the solution to the problem. It was a bad solution. There was a more there was a more workable solution, there was a more durable solution to the problem. And so here we come back to what we had discussed earlier, the difference in philosophies between Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Allama Iqbal. Sir Syed says, go and be competitive, go get yourself an education, come out and then compete, and then you will do well. Whereas Allama Iqbal doesn't say, don't get yourself educated, but he says, it's through the sword that we can recover our former glories. It's a bad solution.
That's a bad solution in terms of, I mean, some people may say, just to give them the due, that the sword here is get your self-respect back and get your confidence back and then compete. But it can easily be misinterpreted that all it requires is to rekindle some sort of a strong religious feelings, but in a way which really is you start playing a zero-sum game with your adversaries and potential adversaries, right? So
exactly. So don't breed cobras. And in fact, the cobras that we bred in Pakistan, I mean, to win Kashmir or fight the Soviets,
that's
well,
right.
Didn't they come back to bite us?
That's right.
And they're still biting us.
Right.
And now, as this government and as the state weakens, what will happen with the TTP, how far they'll be able to weaken the institutions of state, the police and the army, it's an open question.
Right.
Because having fed religious fanaticism to the masses, you can easily expect that they will get support. They do have support in the masses. Right. That is how the Swat Tahreek of Maulana Fazlullah actually gained and became such a major threat. So that's a cobra as clear as anything.
And Mr. Rizvi,
absolutely, the TLP and Khadim Hussain Rizvi.
Khadim Hussain Rizvi. I mean, the first, of course, is General Ziaul Haq, who hands over, if you will, a Kalashnikov to the religious extremists, and then the Afghan jihad starts, and then, of course, we empower them more. Then, when it ends, we say, well, we have all these great fighters and jihadists, what do we do with them? And we say, aha, we have Kashmir here, and we have anyway a revenge to take for East Pakistan. So we turn this against Kashmir, and then of course we can't sustain that. And so now all those guns get pointed back at Pakistan. I mean, the guns we thought, the cobras we bred to attack other people, now begin to attack Pakistan. So, ladies and gentlemen, you heard our discussion, and the question, and we must ask the most difficult and tough questions, because if we don't ask those difficult and tough questions, there is no way that we can diagnose what ails us as a society, as a collective body. Right? And the first question of the 5 that Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy raises in his book that we talked about, was partition worth the price? And now, as the answer is that it's a mixed bag. The answer, there are winners and losers, and then there are the cobras, that we misapplied a solution that we needed to on a problem. So we will take up the second question after this break. Thank you.